Hello and good evening. I'm Stephanie Coleman, Community Education Manager at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History and Sea Center. Welcome to Science Pub. Tonight we are sponsored by Hub International, so thank you to Hub for helping support the museum and free public programs like this one. If you would like to sponsor a program or donate to help, please click on the donate button that should be in your chat box now. And thank you to all of you who have donated or renewed your memberships. We've definitely felt the community's support over the last couple of months. Just a reminder, our memberships are a great holiday gift. So if you need a holiday gift, a membership to the Museum and Sea Center is always loved. We want to highlight Dargan's Irish Pub and hope that you are continuing to support them and all of your other local favorite businesses. We have a lot of fun programs coming up to your computer screen in the next few months to quench your thirst for knowledge, including some virtual field trips, winter camps, after school classes, art workshops, and more. So please explore the museum's website for more details or email me, and I'll be happy to connect you with the correct point person. So now to the good stuff. Let's dive into our Science Pub tonight. So tonight with us, we have Ann Vileisis. So Ann is an environmental historian and an independent scholar. She studied history and environmental studies at Yale and Utah State University. Her first book, Discovering the Unknown Landscape, A History of America's Wetlands, won 2 National History Awards from the American Historical Association and the American Society for Environmental History. Her second book, Kitchen Literacy, How We Lost Knowledge of Where Food Comes From and Why We Need to Get It Back, was recognized in one of my favorite magazines, Real Simple Magazine, as one of the 50 books that will change your life. Her new work, Abalone, The Remarkable History and Uncertain Future of California's Ionic Shellfish, has been called by Dr. Callum Roberts truly marvelous, unexpected joy of a book. I'm glad to welcome her tonight to talk all about abalone. So Ann.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I love the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum, so I'm really delighted to be here and want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. So I want to begin by telling you a bit about how I started on the path of writing a book about abalone. I was actually exploring a cove in Big Sur, and I found this shell. And its iridescence was just stunning to me. I hope you can see it in the light. And I was literally inspired. I just had to know more about the animal that made this beautiful structure. As an environmental historian, I research and write about people's relationship with the natural world through time. And because I'm particularly interested in food history, I was somewhat aware of abalone as an amazing wild food. When I started to ask around, I found that people of a certain age who'd spent time on the coast had nostalgic, fond memories of foraging, diving for, and eating abalone that had once been abundant. But answers to the question of what happened to abalone were less clear, and many younger people had no idea what abalone even were. I soon learned, too, that some abalone had become endangered species. So I realized there was a rich story to discover and an urgent need to better understand how it is that we let wild animals that we cherish, especially those that we use as foods, become imperiled. The story of what happened to abalone is important because it's part of the heritage of our state. It's also relevant to the challenges we face today of conserving marine life into the future. So tonight, I'd like to take you on an armchair tour through some of this epic history, sharing stories from my book. But before we start, we thought it would be good to just gauge everyone's base level of knowledge. So Stephanie's going to throw up a quiz that hopefully you can answer there. Okay, do we have the results yet, Stephanie? Okay, we've got a lot of people somewhere in the middle, so hopefully you guys will all become more of an abalone aficionados tonight. So we're going to start with the basics. Abalone are marine snails. There are 7 species in California and on the West Coast. 2 of these got clumped together. So here you're seeing the brilliant iridescent interiors as well as the colorful backsides of the shells. These beautiful photos were taken by Buzz Owen, pictured here, who started as a commercial diver back in the late 1950s and became a serious self-taught abalone taxonomist. Here he is with a big red abalone shell. Red abalone are the largest species in the world, and this shell is particularly giant. You could serve a salad in it. Abalones range along the whole West Coast, but especially in California. Each species has its own niche of latitudes and also depth of water from deep to shallow related to temperature. Most abalone are subtidal. Here is a live red abalone. The holes in the shell are respiratory pores, which are used by the animal for breathing and also for expelling waste and for broadcasting gametes for reproduction. Abalone primarily eat kelp, sitting and waiting for torn off bits and pieces to float by, which they reach out to lasso with their tentacles. One species, the black abalone, is intertidal, adapted to put up with dramatic changes between the ebb and flow of tides. So starting at the very beginning, the oldest abalone fossils found in California are nearly 70 million years old, which I think is mind-boggling. Abalone disappeared from the fossil record for millions of years after the KT extinction, yet ultimately reappeared with greater prevalence around 2.3 million years ago, having evolved into species more similar to what we have today. During that long period of deep history, abalone developed a big, powerful foot that enables them to grip to rocks and strong shells that they can clamp down around them as shelter. Both food and shell help to protect them in a sea full of hungry predators. But both of these attributes would later become compelling to humans as delicious meat and as a brilliant, beautiful material. Most archaeologists now think that people first came to North America along the coast, a kelp forest highway. In California, some of the earliest evidence for human habitation is the remains of an abalone dinner eaten at the end of the Pleistocene, a shell found by archaeologists on a bluff high above the ocean dating back 13,000 years. For this time before the written word, to know what happened, we have to rely on the record of shells. And based on archaeologists' extensive work at the Channel Islands, we know that shellfish were important to the subsistence of growing human populations for millennia. About 6,000 years ago, beautiful shell artifacts started to become more common in the archaeological record, revealing that abalone were increasingly used for cultural purposes, tools, personal adornment, and other ceremonial and spiritual uses. Abalone shells were traded far and wide throughout native communities in California, the desert Southwest, and the Great Basin. Here are some beautiful abalone creations made by indigenous people living around the San Francisco Bay, collected by British and Russian expeditions around the turn of the 19th century. This photo of a hoopa dancer from more than 100 years later shows abalone used in ceremonial regalia. It's important to note that abalone remain very important to Native Californians today and continue to be used in ceremonial dances by tribes on the North Coast. One highlight of my book research was going to see a demonstration of traditional dances in Eureka, where I learned that abalone is valued not only for its glimmer, but also for its spirit and song, the powerful sound that shells make when they clack together as the regalia is danced to life. The shimmering and singing of abalone in these enduring traditional dances represents a profound spiritual use of abalone shell that stretches back thousands of years up and down the coast. So for the first 13,000 years of human abalone history, we know at a coarse scale that populations and distribution of abalone fluctuated owing to changes in water temperature, sea level, and predation. We also know that indigenous people used and developed a close relationship with these animals. That would change with the arrival of the Spanish on the West Coast, first with galleons, then with missionaries and more mercantilists in the 1700s, a period of history that we're still reckoning with today, when indigenous people were subjected to violence, disease, and the brutal disruption of their subsistence and culture, while newcomers with different views took over their ancestral lands. The Spanish soon put abalone to their own use when mariners realized they could pick up brilliant shells near Monterey, then sail north to trade with native peoples far up the coast for sea otter pelts. By the turn of the 19th century, the fur trade moved south to California, decimating sea otters and unwittingly starting to unravel underwater food webs. With their top predator plucked out, abalone that had previously lived in protected crevices reproduced without check, spread out into more exposed areas, and became super abundant throughout the nearshore marine environment. Monterey became famous for its shells, which British and American mariners called Monterey shells and California shells. But the name that finally stuck, abalone, was derived from the indigenous word of the local Ohlone people, Alun, which you can see here as a place name on a historic Monterey map. And so I like to think the word abalone continues to carry this deep indigenous heritage. The scientific name for California's abalone, Heliotis, also came into use around this time as European scientists started to identify American animals. The genus name Heliotis means sea ear, first named by Aristotle because the abalone where he lived in the Mediterranean were about the size and shape of a human ear. This illustration from an early 19th century British zoological journal is the first I found for a California abalone species, black abalone, Heliotis crescerodii. The most important thing to note about this pivotal time for our abalone story is that the new superabundance of abalone was fundamentally misinterpreted. Newcomers streaming into California regarded plentiful abalone as the natural state of the coast. They did not realize that they were seeing an ecosystem that had been severely disrupted. The next phase of human abalone history, which I call the abalone century, begins with the gold rush, which drew people from all over the world to find riches. Chinese immigrants sailed across the Pacific hoping to find gold, but some found a different treasure on the rocky shores near Monterey and the flourishing abundance of abalone. An abalone rush began in the late 1850s with hundreds of Chinese immigrants setting out to work gathering abalone from shallow waters. The Chinese already had a long heritage of holding abalone in high esteem for beautiful inlay work, medicinal purposes, and food, so a large export market quickly developed. Fishermen would remove fresh meat from shells, boil it, salt it, and then dry it on the beach. The final product was a hard chunk the size of a fist that, according to more than one reporter, resembled a horse's hoof. The cured dried meat was savored by the Chinese for the rich umami flavor it brought to soups. But at the time, white Californians did not regard abalone favorably as foods owing to racial prejudice and because they didn't know how to prepare it. So after the easiest to pick abalone were fished out in the Monterey area, the rush spread south. And by the 1870s, the Chinese had developed an extensive trade network with large junks picking up dried abalone from fishing camps peppered down the coast to San Diego and beyond. The daily Alta California reported massive abalone exports with thousands of 100-pound sacks of dried meat and shells loaded on ships in San Francisco. By the 1880s, fishers had removed millions of abalone, mostly from intertidal zones in the mainland, and were starting to tap offshore islands too. Concerns about overfishing were raised, and I'll get to that in a bit, but ultimately the Chinese abalone fishery was ended by broader racial hostilities when the US Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 1880s. This created a bit of a timeout for some abalone to rebound. But soon a new group began harvesting. This time it was fishermen from Japan, which also had a long tradition of holding abalone in high esteem. In the late 19th century, Japan was in a modernizing mode following the engineering and science of Europe and America. So when Japanese fishermen encountered the cold waters of Monterey, they adopted the new technology of hard hat dive suits and began to take untapped abalone from deeper waters. Each boat had a crew to support a single diver, rowing into position, pumping air through a supply hose, cutting kelp, and hauling up baskets of shellfish. Here is Genosuke Kodani, who is credited with starting California's modern abalone industry, standing with drying racks at Point Lobos. Racks of drying abalone and large piles of shells soon became common sights up and down the coast. Japanese fishermen also worked south of the Palos Verde Peninsula, too. Almost as soon as the abalone rush had begun, coastal communities began to voice concerns that too many abalone were being taken. Because everyone believed that the abalone abundance was natural, the large piles of shells were seen as plunder. By the turn of the 20th century, the prevalent intertidal and shallow-dwelling abalone had become uncommon, and newspaper headlines warned that California's abalone were headed for extermination. This was a time when Americans were first becoming concerned about conservation. They'd seen that we could eradicate species through market hunting with the demise of the bison and passenger pigeons, and East Coast salmon and shad runs had already been decimated too. In response to growing alarm, some counties passed fishing bans. And then in 1901, the California Fish and Game Commission finally took statewide action, setting a size limit for the first time, about 8 inches in length, to give abalone time to reproduce before they were fished out. There was an aspiration that California could do better with its fisheries by using scientific management. So the commission also directed USC biologist Charles Lincoln Edwards to study abalone in Southern California. Learning from Japanese divers, he became one of the first marine biologists to take the plunge in a hard hat suit. And he soon became very concerned to see so many abalone being taken. Edwards warned that the risk of extermination was real and recommended visionary strategies to conserve the fishery, a 2-year timeout from fishing, setting aside abalone reservations, and rotating fishing ground around to different areas. Edwards' biologically based ideas were never acted on, but in 1913, the xenophobic legislature took a different tack to wholly prohibit abalone exports from California, reportedly with the aim of crippling the Japanese fishery. This was the second time that a racially motivated policy gave slow-growing abalone a reprieve. Meanwhile, a new kind of interest in abalone had grown. With the arrival of the railroad in Los Angeles in the 1870s, affluent tourists started to come to California to appreciate the fresh air and beautiful scenery, and abalone soon became a star tourist attraction, with visitors hunting for shells. One of the first places that this recreational tourism took off was on Catalina Island. The resort became famous as a place where people could catch giant fish, but also swim, explore rocky shores and tide pools, and search for seashells. One of the most popular resort activities was to take a tour in a glass-bottom boat to view undersea marine gardens with dramatic names like the Grand Canyon of the Pacific. Tourists could pay their boatmen a quarter to dive down and retrieve an abalone shell, which soon became a quintessential California souvenir. The shells became popular up and down the coast, such as here at Pacific Grove and near Monterey. Here's a stand run by a Chinese fisherman's family selling shells to tourists on 17 Mile Drive. Increasingly, too, more people who identified as sportsmen started to hunt abalone for recreation in nearshore areas. And before long, the shellfish started to become more scarce. Sportsmen blamed commercial divers for taking too many abalone, while commercial divers thought that sportsmen were to blame. Harold Heath, an invertebrate biologist from Hopkins Marine Station in Monterey, was drawn into the fray. He studied red abalone reproduction and discovered that the mollusks put out millions of eggs every time they spawned. Presuming they spawned every year, he theorized that it would be materially impossible to reduce their number if size limits were followed, because the animals would be able to spawn many times before being fished out. Because California was mostly interested in expanding its commercial fisheries, and there still seemed to be plenty of abalone in deep waters around Monterey, Heath's findings eclipsed Edwards' earlier admonitions, leading the state fisheries agency to generally dismiss sportsmen's concerns about conservation. But dwindling nearshore abalone meant conflicts between sportsmen and commercial divers would continue for decades. So in my book, I braid together different threads of abalone history, how abalone became a commodity through commercial fishing, an icon through recreation, and also how scientists learned more about abalone through time. But I want to share a few stories too about how abalone entered other elements of California culture. In the early 20th century, the stature of abalone hunting and eating was boosted by this set of well-known poets and writers: George Sterling, Mary Austin, and Jack London, known as the Carmel Bohemians. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, they left the city behind and headed to Carmel to live a simple creative life, writing poems and books, growing their own food, and foraging for abalone became a central part of their scene. The shellfish wasn't just a source of free food, but also a part of their vigor and inspiration. Sterling and London would dive for abalone and bring them back for beachside dinners. It turns out that an important part of preparing abalone's unusual meat is that you have to pound it for an extended period. To make the tedious job more fun, the Bohemians made up lines of rhyming verse to sing while pounding. It would have remained a playful private game had the writers not been so famous. And I just have to say, I think this LA Times headline would definitely be clickbait today. In particular, Jack London wrote a novel with characters who traveled to Carmel, met up with the writers, and learned their ritual of pounding abalone and singing what would become known as the Abalone Song. So here we are at about halftime, and I think we can use a little entertainment break. So I'm going to teach you a couple verses of this song, which captures the Bohemian spirit. The words are on the screen, and even though this is a little weird through a webinar, you can sing along at home to the tune of Yankee Doodle. Oh, some folks boast of quail on toast because they think it's Tony, but I'm content to owe my rent and live on abalone. We sit around and pound, but not with acrimony, because our object is a gob of sizzling abalone. So the verses go on, and you could learn them if you want to Google them. Hopefully that was as much fun for you as it was for me. You can see the Abalone Song would go on to be published as sheet music as part of the World's Fair of 1939. Abalone also became famous through the promotional efforts of one of California's first celebrity chefs, Pop Ernest. A German immigrant, Pop made his way to Monterey, where he was impressed by the massive export of abalone by Japanese fishermen, and he thought Americans should be eating more of the shellfish too. He developed a recipe for abalone fillets akin to the German Wiener Schnitzel. And when the state banned all export of abalone in 1913, he was well positioned to promote it as a premium seafood for California eaters, more specifically, white eaters who were still mostly unfamiliar with the shellfish, which you can see alluded to here in an ad for one of the restaurants where he worked in San Francisco, reminding us again of the prevalent ambiance of racialized thinking at the time. Eventually, Pop built a restaurant right on the Monterey Wharf, buying his abalone from Japanese fishermen, thereby helping to keep the fishery going strong. His restaurant soon became a destination for tourists and celebrities who wanted to try the increasingly popular shellfish. As domestic demand for abalone grew, commercial take continued to grow as well. Between 1916, when the state started to track landings, and 1930, Monterey was considered California's abalone capital. But with growing harvests, local abalone beds finally wore thin and the industry shifted south. Near Morro Bay, the Pierce brothers learned the trade of hard hat diving by watching Japanese divers and started to harvest fresh beds along the Central Coast. With new gas-powered boats and air compressors, divers could routinely take 100 dozen abalone a day. And by the start of World War II, In just a decade, a very small number of divers had fished out 10 million pounds, or about 1/4 million animals, by hand. Through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, abalone was eaten and enjoyed in communities up and down the coast from LA to Ventura to Pisno Beach, Half Moon Bay, and up on beyond Eureka. After the opening of the Golden Gate Bridge in 1938, recreational shore picking of abalone became more important for tourism on the North Coast, which is one reason communities there fought hard to keep commercial abalone fishing out. Meanwhile, in Southern California, a new sport of skin diving was started in the 1930s. Here are the Bottom Scratchers, the world's first dive club. Ben Stone, one of the first members, would later recall that they found abalone everywhere they looked when they first started. Through the 1940s, and then after World War II, the sport of skin diving and then scuba diving grew in Southern California. With more people foraging in deeper waters, taking and enjoying more seafood and shellfish, abalone became a bigger and meaningful part of more people's lives, but the animals became increasingly scarce as well. You can see here that annual landings from commercial fishing grew and grew, with a big break in the middle for World War II when Monterey's Japanese abalone fleet was terminated after fishermen were shamefully sent to internment camps, and white divers were directed to harvest seaweed to supply the war effort. But when the fishery resumed after the war, with many returning veterans joining its ranks, the catch ramped up to a high peak of more than 5 million pounds taken in 1958. But soon thereafter, in the mid to late 1960s, commercial abalone landings began to drop and then plummet without much advance warning, the ending of the abalone century. So what happened? A number of things, one after another, piling on to finally erode the mass buildup of broodstock and ultimately to reduce populations in some cases to alarmingly low levels. First, sea otters rebounded. It was thought that these animals were wholly extirpated from California by the fur trade, but a small population was rediscovered near Big Sur in 1938. It slowly expanded southward. By the 1950s, late 50s, otters had entered an area near San Simeon considered to be the most productive abalone beds in the state. As sea otters arrived, it became clear that they loved to eat abalone. Here you can see evidence. It turns out that otters hunt abalone by breaking their shells with a rock. This set off a bitter and intractable conflict between commercial abalone fishing, who wanted the state to corral and move the otters elsewhere, and those rooting for otter recovery, the group called Friends of the Sea Otter, with its influential leader, Margaret Owings, a story I tell in greater depth in my book. This is a key pivot point in our story, though, because up until this time, people believed that abalone were an inexhaustible seafood and that their prevalence was natural and owed to the animal's inherent superfecundity. But the return of the sea otter pointed to a whole new understanding. In short, there would have been no abalone fishery at all had the sea otters not been wiped out. The abalone fishery had been based on a massive accumulation of stocks, a windfall. At the time, knowledge of kelp forest food webs, with sea otters as keystone species influencing the entire ecosystem, was still just emerging, based on new ecological research in Alaska, where scientists studied islands with and without otters and found far richer kelp forests where otters were present and kept kelp-eating urchins in check. It was impossible to apply this science from Alaska and California, especially in the midst of such a contentious conflict. But it raised many new questions. How had abalone and sea otters coexisted in the past, and could they coexist again? Was the ecosystem adjusting back to a more natural state? It was the start of a larger paradigm shift where we started to see the animals we use as foods not only as a kind of crop to be harvested, but also as parts of more complex ecological communities. There was a lot more going on underwater than we knew. Meanwhile, as the sea otters expanded their range southward, fishermen were compelled to abandon their prized abalone grounds. Red abalone persisted in protected crevices, but there was no longer a surplus for fishing. At that point, California's commercial abalone fishery moved south again, this time with divers working reefs off the Southern California mainland, increasingly the Channel Islands. With continued commercial take by more and more divers with more powerful boats, as well as still increasing recreational harvest, abalone became more scarce in these areas as well. In the early 1970s, the state directed its biologists to figure out why abalone landings had collapsed in Southern California and what to do about it. After several years of surveys, tagging, and recapturing animals, they found that overfishing, both commercial and recreational, had already significantly reduced broodstock in many areas, and that the animals couldn't keep up with fishing pressure. Recognizing that the new understanding of abalone as a windfall fishery meant fishers would need to adjust to a lower take, biologists made several recommendations. Perhaps most important, to restrict commercial fishing to limited entry with just 70 divers. But reeling from the sea otter expansion, the industry pushed back, and ultimately the state conceded to limited entry with 200 divers. So fishing for abalone continued. Another thing that happened in Southern California were El Niños, a big one in 1958, and then an even larger one in 1983, causing massive storms and an influx of warm water. It's important to remember that until the 1980s, people considered these big storms to be aberrations. Scientists and fishery members had not yet realized that they were regular oceanic fluctuations that occur on an episodic basis. Strong El Niños affected abalone in several ways. Warm water and storms devastate kelp that abalone eat, thereby reducing the animal's growth, but also their ability to reproduce. Up until this time, it was generally presumed that abalone reproduced every year, but scientists who studied what happened before and after the 1983 El Niño discovered this was not the case. And as fishing picked up again, when the slow-growing animals reached legal size, the abalone broodstock that had long sustained a heavy harvest was in some places totally mined out. This, of course, wasn't realized until years later. Dr. Mia Tegner was a marine scientist interested in both abalone and El Niños. And by the 1990s, with rising concern about global warming, she would see El Niños were already like postcards from the future, already showing us the insidious ways that elevated seawater temperature could deeply affect marine life. So in the wake of the 1983 El Niño, another problem hit. This before photo was taken on the remote shores of Santa Rosa Island in the early 1980s, where black abalone still thrived and spread out all over the intertidal zone. Biologists there were doing baseline surveys of marine life in the intertidal zone, setting up transects so that they could monitor environmental changes in the newly designated Channel Islands National Park. Soon they found black abalone that normally clamped down hard to rocks during low tide were hanging limp and loose and then dropping off helpless. The biologists soon realized they were witnessing an epidemic. Over the course of just a few short years, 99% of black abalone on the Channel Islands withered up and died. Then the mysterious pathogen made its way to the mainland and spread up and down the coast too. It was alarming for the biologists to see so many animals die in such a short time. They called it Withering Syndrome. Ultimately, pathologists would determine it was caused by a bacterium that became particularly active in warm water, and that it could afflict other species of abalone as well, albeit to a lesser degree. And if that weren't enough, the biologists realized too that no one had seen a white abalone in quite a long time. When they failed to find them with regular dive surveys, they searched deeper waters with a small submarine. Here is state biologist Pete Hawker climbing to the Delta sub. Over the course of several days, biologists with the Park Service and the California Department of Fish and Game surveyed 77,000 square meters of reef and found only 4 white abalone. Here's a view from the sub looking at a lone white abalone too far away from any possible mate. Reviewing the data and historic surveys, the biologists hypothesized the once abundant animals had been unwittingly fished out, leaving too few animals too far apart to reproduce. It's called the Ali effect. When animal populations are reduced to extremely low levels, they have trouble reproducing because the mates can't find each other. In the case of abalone, the animal's gametes broadcast into seawater can't find each other. This made the abalone biologists realize that it was critically important to monitor not just numbers, but the density of abalone too. So as state biologists pieced together the dire straits of the black and white abalone in Southern California in the early 1990s, these animals, along with pink, green, and red abalone, were still being fished commercially. At that point, the biologists realized that California could no longer manage them for a fishery. It had to manage them to survive. And this is another crucial pivot point in the story. The commercial industry thought that there were still enough animals to fish in some remote places, but the state biologists were wary of the accumulating threats and pressed hard to close the fishery for black abalone in 1993 and for whites, pinks, and greens in 1996, aiming to conserve the remaining broodstock. Ultimately, white abalone would become the first marine invertebrate to be listed as an endangered species in 2001, and the black abalone would be listed as well in 2009. But that left the commercial and sport fisheries still open for red abalone, which were also vulnerable to poaching. In my book, I tell the story of how recreational divers from throughout California came together in a contentious, high-stakes political campaign to press the state to finally close the commercial fishery, and also their own sport fishery from San Francisco south in 1997 to save broodstock of these animals too, with the hope that someday they might rebound. They also pushed the state to finally, after all these years, come up with an abalone recovery and management plan. Drawing on the latest science, it focused on recovery for Southern California species and management of the sport fishery, still growing strong on the North Coast. In retrospect, it's very important to observe that it was not easy for fishery managers to foresee when animals would reach a critical tipping point, from being wholly available for the fishery to becoming imperiled. And even in face of warning signs, it was hard to ratchet back California's abalone fisheries because fishers vigorously argued that there were more animals to fish, even as the populations and distributions of abalone shrunk, and even as cumulative environmental threats piled on. This, I think, underscores the importance of taking a precautionary approach to managing all animals that we still use as wild foods, and also for more diverse groups of people, not only fishers, to become engaged and to advocate for sustainable fisheries and conservation. So I want to shift gears now to tell you about what's been happening to some of these animals more recently. So with the endangered white abalone, the animals were so far apart that biologists knew there would be no way they could ever reproduce. So back in the late 90s, they decided to bring in some of the few remaining animals from the wild to start a captive breeding program. In my book, I recount this effort with all its monumental challenges and amazing discoveries. The bottom line is it's much harder to recover an endangered species than it would have been to conserve it in the first place. But after some heartbreaking setbacks, in the past couple of years, there have been some exciting milestones of success. The captive breeding program is now anchored at the Bodega Marine Lab, and scientists there have finally figured out how to breed large numbers of healthy juveniles. Here you can see one of these animals up close. The Santa Barbara Natural History Museum Sea Center has long been one of the partnering organizations with this important recovery project, since it was decided to split up the captive broodstock so as not to put all eggs in one basket, so to speak. The Sea Center has been involved in some of the spawning attempts and also in raising and holding juvenile abalone for outplanting, so you can head down and see some of them yourself. NOAA Fisheries, which has the purview over recovery of endangered marine species, has funded and pulled together many key partnering organizations, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Santa Monica Bay Foundation, the University of California, and several other coastal aquaria to scale up recovery efforts. And just last fall, captive raised white abalone were finally outplanted for the first time. Putting these tiny abalone out into an ocean full of predators is part of a challenge for recovery. And so different methods are being tested to see what will work best to protect these animals until they can finally become established. Here you can see a tube that's being tested and a protective cage. This is a continuing project, and the ultimate goal is to get lots of white abalone pulse planted out into the ocean where they can reproduce on their own and help rebuild a viable population. And hopefully, all that is being learned in recovering these endangered abalone can be applied, if need be, to other species and other marine animals in the future. With the endangered black abalone, the species most heavily afflicted by withering syndrome, the approach has been different. It was always hoped that there might be some pockets of disease-resistant animals. And it turns out that in very few places in the Channel Islands, black abalone have persisted and may now be starting to show some signs of rebound. They've also persisted in central California, where water is cold. Another hopeful thing is that scientists studying withering syndrome discovered something different when they were assaying tissues about 7 years ago. It turned out to be a virus, a bacteriophage that breaks down the disease bacterium. Additional research has confirmed that abalone afflicted by withering syndrome can endure the infection better and with far fewer symptoms if the virus is present too. And in recent years, researchers have determined that bacteriophage virus has spread through most California waters where withering syndrome bacterium is present, and may be helping to make it possible for black abalone and perhaps other species to recover. And so a virus may well be a hero in this abalone story. Meanwhile, the pink and green abalone of Southern California never became endangered, but they became depleted on the mainland coast. After 23 years of fishing closure, they may slowly be starting to rebound in some spots. But in Orange County's still empty nearshore reefs, efforts to kickstart green abalone recovery have been spearheaded by marine biologist educator and NGO volunteer coordinator extraordinaire Nancy Caruso. Planning closely with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Nancy has collected wild broodstock from the Channel Islands and is now raising green abalone at local aquaria for outplanting, aiming to rebuild the local population there. Nancy and her team of volunteer divers who do surveys, monitoring, and watchdogging of restored abalone exemplify what it means for people to develop a new kind of relationship with abalone, built on an ethic of getting to know local places and getting inspired to restore and steward their marine life. Nancy's NGO is called Get Inspired. And finally, we must return to this abalone. And so here, as we near the end of this talk, we have another quiz question to test your newfound abalone knowledge. Can you identify this abalone species? So do we have the poll results, Stephanie? Here we go. Yes. Wow. Everybody, lots of people got that one right. So very exciting. You're now all becoming abalone experts. As I mentioned earlier, Northern California communities had always resisted commercial abalone fishing and also scuba diving. So a freediving only sport fishery there had long thrived, replenished by red abalone parents in deeper water than could be reached by breath hold divers. Thousands of divers and shore pickers were coming each year from all over the state to hunt for abalone in kelp-rich coves, and then to repair to campgrounds to pound and fry up abalone, in a tradition that in some families spanned generations. But then a perfect storm of environmental stressors hit. In 2011, there was a harmful algal bloom that killed off hundreds of abalone off the Sonoma coast. In 2013, sea star wasting disease swept up the coast, decimating sea stars, including these sunflower stars, now considered to be mostly extirpated except for some remnant populations up in Canada. It turns out that sea stars are important predators of purple urchins, and so without them, aggressive kelp-eating urchins grew without check. Then in 2014, a marine heat wave hit called the blob from the north and El Nino from the south, making it harder for kelp, which need cold, nutrient-rich water to grow. Between ravenous urchins and warm water, Northern California's kelp forests were soon reduced by more than 93% in just a few years, leading to starvation of thousands of red abalone. Dr. Laura Rogers Bennett, who started a kelp forest monitoring program for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, documented these heartbreaking changes, including a massive reduction in abalone density in both shallow and deep water areas. In 2017, the California Fish and Game Commission was compelled to close the North Coast's beloved abalone sport fishery, a closure that's likely to be extended for at least another 5 years in December. The massive scale and speed of this undersea transformation has been sobering and needs to be a serious wake-up call to us all. People are now looking at different ways to address the problems. There are efforts to create urchin-free oases with sport and commercial divers coming together to remove purple urchins in strategic coves to maintain pockets of bull kelp and red abalone. Some scientists are working to bring back the sunflower sea star, that voracious urchin predator, through a captive breeding program. In Southern California, people have long tried to restore smaller areas of degraded kelp forests with some success, and so there are lessons to draw from there too. But perhaps most important is that while all these efforts can help, ocean conditions remain an overarching driver for canopy kelps. Meanwhile, we've also come to realize these great undersea forests are incredibly important for sequestering carbon and thereby helping to stabilize larger climate conditions too. So everything is connected and there's a lot at stake. And so we find ourselves at another pivotal moment, which underscores to me why history is so important. Because the stories we tell ourselves about how we got to now are literally the stepping off point for the future. Embedded in the history I've shared tonight, and especially in my book, we gain a deeper appreciation for some of the profound and enduring cultural values of abalone. And we can see how earlier generations derived tremendous economic benefit and tremendous enjoyment from abalone. But now these modest animals need for us to give something back. Hopefully, the perspective of history, what we've gotten wrong and right in the past, and all that we've learned can help us in this project. We also need more people to learn and care about marine environments, to fall in love with the rich beauty of these places, their plants and animals, and to get involved in supporting community science efforts with groups like Get Inspired and Reef Check. We need for more people to advocate for abalone recovery and for marine ecosystems too, especially in the face of the climate crisis. There are no easy answers, but we will need to come together to find ways to rebuild resilience in our marine ecosystems. As I worked on my book, a telling detail I discovered early on stuck with me all the way through. That many different cultures around the Pacific have long associated abalone with a vision. And so it's my hope that sharing this story of abalone can help us all to see a better path forward for these cherished creatures and for all the life of the sea and earth. It's time to get on it. So thank you very much.
And thank you. That was wonderful. And yes, I hope that, everyone can understand the importance of, how the interconnectivity of all of these animals and ecosystems. So we're going to open it up for question and answer. As we get those questions rolling in, I thought I'd start with one. So as you've had, you've done a lot of research for your books over the years, what has been one of your most favorite experiences?
Well, I have to say a lot of the research I did was in libraries and archives and things like that. But my favorite experiences were going out to see abalone. And the best thing probably was going out to the Channel Islands. And I had a chance to go out to San Nicolas Island, which is a place where the black abalone are rebounding. And so I literally felt like in the course of, in the time I spent writing this book, actually nearly 10 years, that I got to bear witness to that, to the beginnings of a rebound of this amazing creature. And so, the news of for abalone is somewhat mixed, but I think there's tremendous hope in the fact that these animals are so resilient if we give them a chance.
Thank you very much. So we've had a couple of chats that are really just thanking you for such a great presentation and photos. And then Peter Sawyer has a question. So did you do any research on the mariculture of abalone? He said some of us have very fond memories of consumption of abalone and would like to pass this on to their children. So
Yeah,
anything about sustainable seafood?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wrote my book, in my book, I focused on wild abalone, and I talked a little bit, I wrote about some of the challenges of using mariculture to enhance fisheries in the book. But it's a really good question of how can we eat abalone? How can we have a sustainable fishery? And I think through efforts, we've learned a lot more about how to make it safer. Of course, there are risks with planting abalone out into the ocean that are raised by aquaculture, things like diseases and such, and potential to affect genetic diversity and long-term viability of wild abalone. But there are also some great abalone farms on the coast of California right now. They're small artisanal operations, the Abalone Farm north of Cayucas, and another one that I really think is cool in Monterey, the Monterey Abalone Company, where they raise abalone in baskets hung from the wharf. So I think there might be more opportunity to have more of those artisanal abalone aquaculture facilities or operations in the future, once we can be sure that we're going to not harm the wild abalone.
Thank you. So we have a couple of other questions. Cassie Savage asks, how can archaeologists tell that abalone were discovered that on cliffs 13,000 years ago were consumed by humans?
Well, I think it's that particular shell that was found at a site where there was also evidence it was like a chert outcrop, so there was also evidence of people that were making points that could be used for hunting. And so a lot of the evidence of archaeology going back deep requires some level of deduction, but I think it was assumed that it was deduced that somebody must have carried that abalone up there, kind of like a portable meal that they could bring with them up to that high spot. One of the things that's interesting is that a lot of the lowest archaeological sites that may have gone back deeper in time may have been covered by sea level rise. So it's rare to have an archaeological site that's quite that old.
Thank you. All right. So Karen, who is currently on Santa Rosa Island and viewing this live. So thank you, Karen, on Santa Rosa Island. Was the photo of the black abalone on Santa Rosa Island from Black Rock area? Are there any there now?
I don't know about what's happening on Santa Rosa Island. That photo was from the southwest side of Santa Rosa Island. I don't know what's the status of that is, and so maybe somebody else in the chat does. I do know that some of the sites I'm aware where they've rebounded are in San Miguel and San Nicolas.
Actually, guys, so I misread that. Sorry, Karen. So she wants to know if there are any more photos.
I don't have any more photos in particular, but I'm sure there are some available probably through the National Park Service.
Great, thanks, Anne. Robert wants to know if the Monterey Bay Aquarium is involved in abalone research that you're aware of.
I am not aware of abalone research that they've been involved in. They're certainly involved in ecosystem research related to, the sea otters and how they affect the marine ecosystems in their area. I believe that. I'm not entirely sure what they're doing right now with regards to abalone. There's also some research in that area related out of the University of Santa Cruz about black abalone, which are persisting in that zone. And there's also a lot of research in that area now because the kelp forests decline that I showed on the North Coast has been expanding southward. So people are really having to look at whole ecosystems and try to figure out what's going on, to try to figure out a path forward to build resilience, as I suggested.
Thank you. Okay, Sue has a few. So it says, I remember a time when sea otters were relocated to San Nicolas Island to help the abalone survive. Was this an effort by the California Abalone Association? Do you know that?
It's actually a little bit of a different story. I tell a little bit in my book. What happened is that conflict I talked about in the 1960s ultimately led to the idea there was a big push to try to move some sea otters, but it ultimately became it was infeasible to really move them to save the abalone fishery because if you moved them somewhere else, they would eat something else. You know, they'd be they disrupt other fisheries. But it became clear that since there was only that one sea otter population, that it would be wise to set up a second population. And so that second sea otter population moved to San Nicolas Island, was started to conserve sea otters, and in fact created a conflict with the commercial abalone fishers who still were harvesting out there in San Nicolas Island. So they've never liked to have sea otters, of course, because they consider them competitors with the fishery. One of the things that I think is interesting now is that we're seeing on the North Coast that um, there's just so many urchins right now that it's going to be impossible to fish them all out. And so I think we are looking at bigger ecosystems when we think about, do predators have a role, be it sea stars or possibly sea otters, in helping to stabilize the whole ecosystem. This is just I think this is something people are beginning to look at. And it's something that I think we're coming to terms with as we better understand the history of these ecosystems.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, so Tracy asks, is there still an abalone cultivation project just up the coast, maybe around Rancho dos Pueblos?
You know, I didn't quite hear what you broke up on me for a second there.
So Tracy asks if there is still an abalone cultivation project just up the coast, maybe by Rancho dos Pueblos. Do you know of any that are very local?
That might be do you mean the cultured abalone near Goleta, perhaps? That abalone farm, I think, is been involved. I know it's been involved in some of these restoration efforts. It's been very much involved. And one of the things that's been neat is that abalone, to go back to the earlier conversation, is that stuff that we learned in abalone mariculture has helped with the recovery of endangered species, and stuff we've learned through the recovery of endangered species has helped with to make mariculture better. But I don't know if that abalone farm is producing abalone for commercial consumption, but you might get on and check that out on their Facebook page or their website. It's called the Cultured Abalone, I believe.
Thank you, Anne. So we're going to end the talk with this one last question. And Evelyn also really gives you a lot of props. So she says, I've never experienced such an informative talk on such a beloved creature. Thank you so much. So thank you, Anne. And her question is, about a year or so ago, I read an article about nighttime abalone poachers. Is this a real problem?
Well, abalone poaching has definitely been a problem, and it was especially a problem when we still had a lot of abalone. But yeah, I mean, these animals are so valuable and so cherished. I didn't really go into it, in my talk tonight. There's a lot more stories and a lot more depth in my book, of course. But at one point there, before the fisheries were closed, abalone, each one was worth over $100 on a black market. And so they're very lucrative. They were very lucrative for people who wanted to sell them. And so that was a really difficult and remains a difficult challenge, how to protect these animals that are so valuable economically as well as culturally and, to us all. And that's why, I really think it takes takes more of us really paying attention and coming to take care of the marine environment better. We need more eyes on the water. We need more people who care. And so anyway, but I just want to end by giving a plug for my book also. This is the Shameful Commerce moment, which is, as I said, my book goes into lots more stories, and I had the time to have take time with language in a way that's hard to do when you give a talk. So I hope you'll check it out. And it's always great to give a plug for your buy a book at your local bookstores. So check it out, and I hope that you will find it to be interesting and enjoyable. It's been great to be here with you all tonight, and I hope everybody stays safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anne. So before we go, I want to also do a plug for our next month's Science Pub. So next month we have Corrine Henning-Laverty, and she is going to be discussing her book, The North American Galapagos, a biological survey. And she was originally scheduled to talk in our May Science Pub, which then got postponed due to COVID, and she is willing to come back and present virtually. And we are so excited. This was a very popular Science Pub topic. So I hope that you can join us all on December 14th next month. Until then, as Anne said, take care, be safe. And thank you all so much for your support. And the chat box is just really bringing in all of the love for you. So thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, and take care, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.